All right, so let's talk combined arms, because a lot of times people talk about combined arms and they really don't necessarily remember because they haven't learned about it since they were younger leaders, right? And so you see the definition at the top. And it's this idea that the sum of what you're trying to do is greater than the individual weight of each of the arms or capabilities that are employed. Right? And we want to use those capabilities in complementary and reinforcing ways. The big idea here that the quotations from Patton and Sun Tzu get to, that you're only limited by your imagination in terms of combining the tools that are available, both Army and Joint, to achieve outcomes that can be exploited to achieve victory during conflict. All right, so the operational environment. This is one of the key ideas here in MDO. We've had diagrams that show the operational environment in the past, and one of the problems with that was that they were too complicated. Right? It was very hard to make them applicable at every echelon in every context. And so we think we've remedied that. So if you look at the two surface domains of the Earth, with the understanding by us that there is more blue than green on planet Earth, but we're the premier land force for the US government. So therefore, we're going to have more green than blue. But then you have the air over top of that and space over top of that. And cyberspace transits each of those other four domains. And it transits through nodes that are essentially man-made and encompass both civilian and military platforms or architecture to make cyberspace work. Each of those five physical domains has three dimensions. All right, so you see on the slide that we understand those five domains, that world around us, in terms of the physical, human, and information dimensions. That's where we're trying to affect change when we conduct operations. We're not trying to change the physical world. We're trying to achieve outcomes in those dimensions that are favorable to the U.S. Joint Force. We defined domains for the first time, so while the different domains were defined in joint doctrine, we didn't actually define what a domain is. And when you understand that domain, you understand what the focus of each of the different services are. So if the Army is primarily land and the Navy is maritime, the Air Force is air, you can see that each of those services in and of themselves are multi-domain, much like the U.S. Army is, right? So there's this overlap. And that gets back to that complementary and reinforcing approach that has really been the secret sauce of the U.S. Joint Force for a very long time. The other thing we like to talk on is these forms of advantage. All right, and this is also one of those important things that's critical to understanding this. None of those forms of advantage are decisive in and of themselves, okay? You can enjoy significant physical advantages, but if your human material, the troops that you're leading, cannot execute the courses of action that you have with the equipment they have, then you really have got a significant problem. If you lack the situational awareness or the ability to make decisions, then you have a real problem. You can have perfect situational awareness and have forces out of position in such a way that you cannot make the kinds of decisions you need to defeat the threat. And you can look at physical, human, and information advantage using Afghanistan last year, Ukraine this year, Nagorno-Karabakh a couple years ago, and just go from the very strategic down to the very tactical and look at physical, human, and information advantages and see how they're dynamic and they affect each other in ways that have very significant military outcomes. Right? So we strive in the U.S. Army to gain and maintain and then exploit all three forms of advantage, and we do that from the very start of the military decision-making process during mission analysis. Let's talk about those contexts I mentioned earlier. So this idea of competition, crisis, and armed conflict, there's a range of military operations that fall under that continuum, right? And so some of them extend from competition through armed conflict, particularly when you're talking about things like military engagement and security cooperation. Other things may start at one end and stop short of conflict, particularly things like crisis response and the limited contingency operations you see on the chart. Large-scale ground combat obviously is firmly all the way over to the right, whereas if you were talking about a regular warfare, it might extend a little bit further to the left. The big idea here, though, is not for folks to get wrapped around the axle in terms of context, because typically echelons below theater army are focused on one context at a time. If you're in a brigade and we're in a conflict, you're not worried about security cooperation. You're worried about defending that piece of ground or conducting an attack against the enemy tomorrow. All right, so we're going to address a few of the words here that people throw around. We want to make sure folks understand these definitions because some of them are new. Defeat is possible without destroying the entirety of the enemy that you're facing. You can defeat an enemy or an adversary during crisis just by causing them to rethink what they're trying to do and change their mind about whether they're going to conduct further aggression or not. This idea of defeat in detail is important, and it's similar to that metaphor of eating the elephant one bite at a time. Right? When you're talking about two evenly matched enemies during a conflict, you're not going to defeat them in a single battle. You may not even defeat them in a single campaign. But you can defeat bits and pieces of them at a time that accrues, one at a time, or simultaneously in different places, and you accrue an advantage over time that creates more and more dilemmas for the threat, right? And we'll get back to defeat in detail later when we talk about convergence. And then we've talked about defeat mechanisms in our doctrine for a while, and in this version of FM30 we spend a lot more time explaining what those defeat mechanisms are and how we think about employing them. The big idea is that you want to employ as many of them at one time as possible. And when we talk about disintegrate, which is a big idea in that original MDO concept, you really can't talk about disintegrate without talking about dislocating, isolating, and destroying parts of the enemy force. So those other three defeat mechanisms are actually the tools that create the conditions of disintegration for the threat. We played around with the definition of disintegrate a little bit so that it isn't so technically focused and it gets to some of the softer ideas in terms of destroying the cohesion of enemy forces. And there's examples of that right from the real world, right? The destruction of those professional soldier companies, right? The contract soldier units in the Russian army has a disproportionate impact on the ability of the rest of the formations to fight, right? When the best troops become casualties, the troops that look up to those guys and say, hey, these guys are the professionals and they are getting beaten up pretty bad. What's going to happen to us, right? So there's more than just one way of looking at it. You look at it through the three dimensions, the information dimension, the human dimension, and the physical dimension. The other bit here is destroy, right? You're not able to destroy the entire enemy army, right? There's no resources to do that, and we do not want to get dragged into some sort of attrition style of warfare. But destruction is still hugely important. And the lower the tactical echelon is, the more important destruction is to the mission tasks that they're assigned. You see at the bottom here what the intent of multi-domain operations is. It's to attack those threats approach. And in past years, you've heard people talk about anti-access error denial. We addressed that in FM30 as well. But again, the employment of those defeat mechanisms in combination to accrue advantages over time is the big idea here. All right, so combat power. This diagram is not in the book. This is something that we put together just to help people envision how we're talking about combat power. So we are now using the joint definition of combat power, which you see at the bottom of the chart, which is really the total means of destructive or disruptive force that we can bring against the threat. So combat power is what we can do and bring to bear against the threat. And so information helps us with that disrupt piece. It also helps us with situational awareness and decision making. Survivability, you think about how we maintain endurance. It's the protection that we accrue either from the platforms we use, the tactics that we use, or employing survivability measures, deception and so forth. Firepower is kind of self-descriptive. And then mobility. And the mobility is always about being more mobile relative to the threat. It's not an absolute thing. It's always in relation to who you're fighting. All of the warfighting functions you see on the left contribute to generating and applying combat power. And again, command and control is the integrating warfighting function that brings it all together. Leadership is that quality difference between us and who we're fighting, right? That's the secret sauce. And so when you think about leadership, you think about, even in the U.S. Army, you go into two identically organized units and you walk into those places and the atmosphere is always different, right? And what's the qualitative difference between that? It's the leadership within that organization.